everyone, Scott Hansen here from NFL Red Zone. I hope you're checking out 1 hour of 5-Yard Rush, one of the best podcasts on NFL football in the UK.
Hey, what's happening, Rush Nation? Here we are, back a bit later than advertised on a Thursday, and I promised you we would have a phenomenal show. I'm really excited for this one. I feel like at this point of the season, it's a really timely lessons to be learned, revisited, and I don't think we're going to necessarily break any unique ground here with what we talk about. But I think in terms of converting losses into wins, in terms of getting fantasy football titles, ships in the harbour, winning games, winning your home leagues, doing everything that you need to do to be successful in January, this is going to be the show. And I couldn't think of anyone better to join me than my good friend Danny, who's the winner of the 2023, although you're calling it the 2024 Orkney Bowl, but considering the most of it took part in 23, I'm calling it the 23 Orkney Bowl. Danny, welcome. You've been on one of our shows before, but welcome back. How you doing, my man?
Yeah, all good, yeah. Managed to get the kids to bed just in time to make it on time.
Well, glad you're able to do that. And I'm going to set a bit of context here. So Danny's a Patreon, right? So Danny, and I'm going to let him talk about his history and I'll ask some questions. But we were having a conversation, right? And he was telling me how well his season's going. And I sort of prompted, what is it this year that's clicked into gear? What is it that's working for you? And he rattled off a few things, and it was a really timely reminder to me. And I've written about these topics and talked about these topics for years. But I was like, this is just now, this point of the season where we've got these injuries, where lots of rosters are in flux. This is a really good time to talk about some of these things on how you can grind out wins now to put yourselves into better places for the playoffs and beyond. So that's where this is kind of stemmed from. But I think before we get into some of that, let's talk a little bit about your history of fantasy football and sort of how long you've been playing, how you got into it, that sort of piece, because it is a fascinating journey you've been on.
Well, it depends on what your definition of football is as well, I suppose. Because
that as well.
Yeah, so most of my background would have been playing, as the Americans would call it, soccer, which I hate using the word for. But like I'd have played that since the Premier League one went live, and before that went live, games before that as well. So like I was always football. And then I would say once some of the daily fantasy sports stuff started, I started getting into some of doing it via other sports as well. So like the golf. So the likes of Jack and Nick and Mark and those guys were doing the DFS for the golf. So I was getting into that. And then NFL was always something I wanted to get into, but I didn't really know where to start with it. So I'd say about 3 years ago, I remember putting a tweet out saying I'm looking to learn about, because I'd never even watched an NFL game at that point. I'm looking to get into NFL, but I always find if you go through doing the fantasy sports side of things, it's the quickest way to learn about the sport, but you'd also get to learn a lot more about of the sport than you would do normally. And because like yourself, you've got links with some of the other guys that do across different sports. So for example, the likes of Jack and Nick and those guys, I was tweeting to them about, I want to get into NFL. And then the next minute I got a tweet from you, and that was the first contact I'd had, saying, I can send you some information. You've got your book. You sent me a copy of one of your books. You sent me a ton of information around how you get into it. I started reading. I read the book, but then I started reading up online and watching loads of videos and stuff. And then you sent me some links to your, your competitions for newbies that, to get you into the swing of things. And I sort of, when I do these types of things, I sort of just, I can't just do a little bit. I'm either doing it fully or I'm not. So I just, I went a bit mad on the research side of things before I didn't watch any games to start with. I just started reading and watching loads of YouTube videos from different content creators and stuff like that, or about all different types of aspects of the game, all the different formats and the scoring, and just threw myself into it. So the first year I started with redraft and a bit of best ball. By the end of the first season, I was already hooked. So then on the second season, I'd gone straight into Dynasty. Even on, and as I say, I didn't know anything about NFL the year before, so I just thought of reading up a bit. I love the stats side of things, so I would always be into the stats and trying to predict what's going to happen in the future based off the Premier League side of things and the golf. And I used to play cricket and all kinds of other fantasy sports. Then I was starting to then see, well, how can I transfer what I know about those type of sports into what I do for NFL? And then, we got chatting. I joined some other leagues. The next thing I know, in the first year, I managed to get an invite into the Warrior Bowl, which was good. And I got to meet a lot of those guys through that and all their crazy competitions, their berserker competitions and their last man standing ones that they do. I ended up in all of them in the first year of playing. So, you just got to meet loads of different people, and then you start following more people on Twitter, and then there's more competitions open up. And there's loads of different ones that I was in. I'm in loads of your competitions, loads of Warrior Bowl ones, and then all the different charity ones I ended up in then. And then in the second season, I got an invite into, somehow got to manage to get into the Scottish Bowl, which was I did absolutely dreadful in. But I'm in it this season, which is the second season in it, and it's completely different now. So I'm flying in that and in the Warrior Bowl this year. So I just throw myself into it all and just keep asking. I just want to learn and know more. And I've learned from other sports that sometimes you don't actually have to watch the sport to be able. It's more around. I like to watch it, but at the same time, it's more around following all the information and all the news and just being on the ball with things. I actually started writing a little list down before I didn't realize how many different things I actually do till I started putting it down on paper. And just looking at it, there's two full pages worth of that's what I would do each week during the fantasy season in a sort of order, where it'd be on a Tuesday I would do this, on Wednesday I'd do that, and then where would I get the information from and how I put it together and stuff like that, and trying to make it easy so that on the Sunday when you're only really waiting on team news and then it's just making a few tweaks and you've done most of the work through the week if you can.
Yeah, it's a process. Stripping that all the way back, the one thing through all of this that people will be shocked at to listen to is this is your third season playing fantasy football.
Yeah.
Right, so this is your third season playing fantasy football.
Well, it's third season following NFL as well.
Third season following NFL, exactly. So, 4 years ago, start of COVID lockdown, you weren't even watching the sport. No. It wasn't even on your radar, really.
No, and now I could talk to somebody and tell them who the running back 3 is on pretty much every single team in the league. I could tell them who their wide receiver 5 is or something like that. It's that's the type of level you've got to get to actually win anything.
Absolutely. But I think the point I'm trying to make here with people is that it doesn't matter whether you've been playing fantasy football for 25 years or you've been playing it for 3 years or 2 years. There's always things to learn and there's always a process. And I think where I see a lot of synergy and where I think there's a lot of good things you'll talk about, you kind of already demonstrated it. It's all about a process, right? You're building towards something, right? Which is ultimately to win, whether it's to win a daily fantasy tournament, whether it's to win your home league, which you probably don't have a big home league given you've been doing it for 3 years, but whether you're trying to win a major tournament, a charity tournament, any league, whatever it is, right? There's a process that builds up to it. It doesn't happen on draft day and it doesn't happen in the playoffs. Yeah. There's this big bit in between that I think people kind of lose and forget about.
Yeah, it's also not to give up as well. So it's the likes of the likes of that Orkney Bowl, there was 8 divisions, so there's 8 different leagues, and then the top so many worked their way through the championships all the way to the final. And I only qualified out of the group on the last game. So I won the last game to sneak in. And then that's when my team went nuts then. And I just started, based off the players I'd got in advance, it just seemed to click and they just started to fly. And I didn't really have to do too much at that point. But I got into the playoffs on the last weekend. If I'd lost that game, I wouldn't have gone anywhere. And then I just happened to get, there's a lot, you can say there's a process, but at the same time, there's a huge, especially in this sport, there's a huge amount of luck involved. Yeah. You can build the best lineup in the world, and then 2 weeks later, they're all injured. And it's how do you deal with that and what you do to try and cover it as well. And having backup plans. It's the plan, that's your first plan, but you probably need 3 or 4 different plans depending on how the season goes.
And I think that's absolutely right. And I think we're at a critical point here of the season. Half the regular season for the fantasy regular season is over. We had a lot of shift in the last 7 to 10 days. You've had major receivers change teams. You've had players' fantasy values rise and fall as a result. You've had season-ending injuries to people like Rashid Shaheed, to Chris Godwin. You've got people like Mike Evans out now for 4 weeks. You've had players that you took in the second round, like Marv Harrison Jr., that's not going to pan out for you.
Yeah. My two best Scottish Bowl players are both out of the season. I had what's the name, Shaheed 2 weeks ago, and then Godwin last week, and those two have had me flying up the league, and now they're both gone.
Yeah, and in a league like that, so for those who don't know the Scottish Bowl, it's 22 rounds, 12 teams. The waivers are pretty thin. Like there's no getting away from it. You're going to have to muddle on without those players. That's just unfortunately the nature of that particular type of tournament. But in other leagues, there is depth, there is talent that you can pick up, you can acquire, you can make moves, you can follow processes that will eke you points per game and points per week that can sneak you in and buy you the time that you need. Because I imagine there's sort of 4 clusters of rosters at this point of the season. The first is the one that's absolutely flying, right? They're 7-0, 6-1, not really had much adversity. A couple of injuries, nothing major, but they're taking along right. They're going to make the playoffs, and they're kind of in forward planning mode, or just swinging and just having a laugh. Then you've got this clux of teams that are doing all right. They're grinding out wins, not having major surgery to their roster. Their roster's in relatively good health. They've maybe got some buys out the way. They've probably got a few buys to come, but they've got the nuts and bolts of their roster and they're feeling all right. Then you've got the teams that are in that sort of zone of 5-2 to 3-4 that have just had a major event happen. They've lost to Godwin. They've lost, probably not Watson was that relevant, but they've lost players that have made, or they're now facing situations where they've got Deontay Johnson this week and he's going to have Bryce Young throw the ball and all of a sudden his fantasy value tanks. Or they've got Devonta Smith and he was 102nd wide receiver last week and he's not going to do much better this week, spoiler alert. And so you've got these major events that are happening where you can't afford to take too many more losses. And you need to think about how to find a way out of it. And then you've got the fourth barrel is those that are just really struggling. They're trying to pick up off the waiver wire, but the waiver wire hasn't been kind this year. Until really the last 2 weeks, there's been very little on the waiver wire to help improve a team. You might have got a Jordan Mason on there. You might have got, a Juwan Jennings for a couple of weeks. You might have got little spits and starts, but there hasn't been the home run hitter off of waivers other than maybe Jordan Mason that there usually is at this point of the season. So they've been struggling in the background and now need to push the chips to save their season. And that's how I see the landscape. And there's obviously going to be little nuances there, and people say, well, I'm kind of a bit of this and a bit of that. I get it, but I'm overgeneralizing millions and millions of leagues around the world.
It feels like at the moment as well, the first, 5 or 6 weeks, the tight ends did nothing. But all of a sudden now, because of all those injuries to wide receivers, the guys are throwing to those tight ends more because they haven't got the right depth. So I had quite a lot of tight ends stored on my benches in a lot of teams. So there'll be in the last few weeks, I've played games where I've been starting 3 tight ends and they've actually been delivering as well, because the depth of wide receiver probably wasn't as good because of all these injuries. But most tight ends are fit at the moment. There's not really many injuries in that area, so they just get more of the ball, I presume.
So last week, Amon St. Brown finished as the wide receiver 1 with about 21-ish points.
He's a my Scottish ball. Yeah, I know that one.
The lowest, and it's the lowest ever wide receiver 1 overall finish in the last 15 years. And that's because I couldn't be bothered to go back further than 15 years.
Yeah.
So the lowest ever total point score to be an overall wide receiver 1 in a week for the last 15 years and potentially more was last week.
And there was 11 tight ends in double figures last week as well. I know that.
Exactly. And like some of these tight ends would have finished as top 12 wide receivers to back that point up. And we've had it's been a really weird season from scoring where we've gone back to a world where the running backs are now almost the elite pieces, where quarterback scoring is...
That's why I'm doing well, because most of my teams are stocked with running backs because everybody was going for wide receivers, and playing DFS a lot and listening to some of the DFS content creators, it's all around, well, if everyone's doing this, is there a way to do it the other way? And if it can, I'd rather come last than come in the middle, and I'll at least try to come top. And that's the way I would look at it. Is like if there seemed to be a huge amount of value in running backs in rounds 3, 4, 5, that would players that you would expect to come a lot sooner, but they were still there because everyone seems to want to start with 3 wide receivers very early now, and I went the opposite. And I'm not saying it's down to skill. It's just sometimes you just have to go different than what everybody else is doing and hope it pans out. And if it does, then you start doing well.
And that's exactly the thing. It's a risky strategy, but it's a strategy that ultimately, and we've talked about this the last couple of years, that if you follow the consensus and you follow the groupthink, you basically have to rely on a greater dependency of luck for your strategy to pay off, because you have to not just outdraft all the people on the similar strategy to you, but you also then need to ensure that your performances outweigh their performances with a similar build type. So you need a lot of additional luck factors. That's schedule, that's things like indoor versus outdoor, that's injuries, not just to the team and the players you have, but the other players of the of players who are playing against them. There's a lot of additional factors that need to go your way. Whereas if you do a contrarian build, whether that's a season long, a DFS, a dynasty contrarian build, the only elements you need for it to work are the players that you pick to hit. Because your strategy is so different that if your players hit and you get the values on each of the players that you draft, you will be in a world where, because your strategy is so different, you'll have more trade partners, you'll have more outs, you'll have a bigger pool of talent to draw from the positions where you're weak. Because there'll be, when everyone's trying to pivot over to your strategy, guess what? People will dump wide receivers left, right, and center, and you'll find serviceable wide receivers you'll be buying at a significant discount, whether that's from free agency, from waivers, from like fab bids become cheaper, because if you're the only one in the market for wide receivers because everyone's got a stockpile of wide receivers and no one's going to go after Sterling Shepard this week, guess what? You're getting him for pennies on the pound because you're probably the only one that's interested in rotating that position. And then what you end up doing is you end up playing like a streaming sort of effect, which we'll get to in some of your strategy. So I like
if it would have worked the same as last season, my team probably would have been bottom of the league because the wide receivers hammered it last year. So it's not a perfect situation. It just works this year.
No, but you could have adapted either way. The point is, if you'd done this build last year and it hadn't worked, you would have still had some trading commodity that you could have used to get out of the situation you're in. The great thing, I think, with a contrarian build is, regardless of what you're trying to achieve, whether obviously you're trying to win the league, but whether it's working or not, you're going to have a certain amount of pool on your roster that, unless you've completely messed up. Now, if you draft players that all fall apart, get injured, don't perform, and it falls apart, and you've just got a bad roster, then you are kind of screwed. But if you've got players, and let's say, for example, you'd started with a heavy running back approach, and you had a guy right now like James Conner on your roster, right, who's surplus to requirements on your roster, but actually to 9 teams in the league, he's a starter.
Yeah.
And it's those kind of situations you can end up in on the contrarian play that you can actually then go and leverage and go, okay, right, and this is where I can ship him probably for more than he's worth, but more importantly, I can get the pieces I need. And that's where, when you're building your rosters, being a different is always mostly advantageous. Now, if you get it wrong and it falls apart, then yeah, you binned it. But there's more pathways to getting out of the trouble you're in, and there's more pathways to victory if you're doing things different. If you follow what everyone else does, and you're all chasing the same pool, like if you are all in a similar sort of build and you're all chasing wide receiver, you're all chasing tight end, it's a much harder place to be.
Yeah, because I've talked to you about this before. I think where you're being it's about knowing who you're playing against. So like I'm playing in tournaments where, say for example, if I'm playing in a 5-yard rush tournament, the chances are a ton of those people are looking at your content, looking at your rankings, and thinking, and they might not all be doing the same, but it's subconsciously they're doing very similar types of builds because they've been listening to your content. So what I would tend to do is I would have 3 or 4 different people that I tend to follow, and I like their content and I sort of trust what they say, and I will switch from one to the other. So what I would do is, for example, I know Rich and Tom do really good content at the Fantasy Sanctuary. So I'm in a lot of tournaments with those guys. So if I'm drafting and I'm in with 7 of the members in my draft, I'll make sure that I'll be looking at your rankings, and I'll be looking at, I use John Hanson's on Fantasy Points. I'd be looking at your two, so trying to get an idea of what you guys think, and then looking at what those are doing. It's sort of knowing in a way where they're actually going to be picking before they pick, because a lot of them are working directly off Rich's rankings. And then when it's someone else's tournament, he sort of switch them around. So like I've entered tournaments from yours, from the Sanctuary, a Fantasy Points tournament, and as we said earlier, I've only been watching and following this for 2 or 3 years. I can't watch a game and know the intricacies of it all when you've been watching it for 2 years. So you've got to try and find people that you sort of trust, and you listen to their podcast and you know that they know what they're talking about, and then you sort of get a picture of 2 or 3 people's, maybe even more together, and then make your judgment on something. And I
think that's a really good point. And I think on top of that, I think you've got to find people that are different in their approach, but also different in their analysis.
Yeah.
So I think Rich and I have fundamentally a similar basis of where we work from, where we're both analytical with video. So we work in similar ways, but the way that we evaluate is probably different. So there are players that Rich is, based on his analytical view, will look at and value players in a slightly different way to which I will value players. And I think Rich goes a lot more off, and he won't mind me saying this, that he'll go more off his analytical views and the models that he builds, whereas I will go a lot more from identifying trends and looking at the history of games and looking at the history of leagues and fantasy and game theory. So I will play more of the overarching perspective of I don't understand how a player can be in this realm when they once were let's take Alvin Kamara, right? It's one of my favorite examples. I from March onwards, on every podcast I ever did, on any podcast I went, on any network, I said that Alvin Kamara is the most undervalued player in fantasy football, and I don't understand it, because you've got the front office have told you that they're not changing a thing. The player who's coming off a season where he was in the top 12, and he would have been higher, but he was suspended. He's healthy, and nothing has changed. Nothing has changed.
And thanks to you, I've got loads of them.
But and I'm not trying to blow my own trumpet here, but my point is that people sometimes are trying to look for things a little bit too hard.
Chris Godwin's the same, isn't he?
Pardon?
Chris Godwin is the same. So Godwin will be going in round 7 and 8 when he should be going in like 5 or something like that.
Well, he should have got earlier than that, but I was quite happy to take it. And again, but that one was a bit more subtle. But in terms of Kamara, people bought into this thought that you had, once a running back gets to 28 years old, they're washed.
Yeah, tell that to Derek Henry.
Well, exactly, and that is my point. Is people faded Derek Henry because of his age, and ultimately you had the whole running back dead zone area, and don't take running backs in this area because it's. And then what happens is that's a really good strategy until everybody does it. It's a really, really good strategy until everybody does it. And then when everyone piles on, what you do is you artificially change the values of all the players around. And so all these wide receivers came up the board. And I remember having Jim Coventry on, and I was talking about Alvin Kamara, right? And him and I fundamentally disagreed. But the disagreement we had strengthened not just my belief, but it also what I like about it is I learned something from that situation I didn't know, and that then strengthened my belief more. And I actually pushed it further because I was like, he was like, well, Kendra Miller, Clint Kubiak, and all the, we talked about, the concepts is not set up for Kamara. And I was just sitting there thinking like, but if this was true, they would have moved on from him, or they would have drafted another running back. Yeah. Or they would have given some signal of intent that is like that there was no confirmation to that line of thought. And people were trying to find, I'm not saying Jim was doing this, but people tend to find a reason why something has to be different. And actually, when there is nothing to be different, and you just have to assume it's the same until something changes. And people like to chase difference. With takes that we had, Brian Robinson was another great example. Brian Robinson was the lead back. He had some injuries. It's another one of those situations. Yeah, but it's the same thing. People didn't like it because they didn't like Cliff Kingsbury. And you're like, okay, there is a change. There is some change there. And Austin Eckler's coming, but we saw what Austin Eckler was. We know what he is, and he's not a traditional running back. So actually, does the parlay change? Or is it what it is?
For newer people like me, though, you sort of have to find the people you trust. And so, like what you're saying there, there's teams there where I've got Kamara, I've got Williams, and people were saying, do you take him as high as that because of Blake Corum? He's going to be taking minutes, etc., and he come down in value because of it. So I took loads of Williams, and then I've took James Conner. Oh, he's too old. I've got loads of James Conner. Derek Henry's the one who's keeping me in that bracket. He's the one winning me games just to keep me in the Orkney Bowl at the moment. I just went because they just keep dropping and dropping and dropping. I just kept taking them, and at one point I was taking 4 in the first in some tournament. Then all my team builds are completely different, but some of them I had 4 running backs in the first 8 rounds or something, and everyone else had 4 or 5 wide receivers.
And the way that I've always viewed fantasy football, and again, I'm just a staunch believer of until the situation changes, stick your course. Yeah. And I'm not saying you need to be so rigid in your approach, you have to do the same thing. But I've always been of this belief that once you get past the top 28 wide receivers, they're all a much of a muchness. And I've said this for 4 or 5 years. That actually the difference between the wide receiver 29 and the wide receiver 50 is like less than 2 points a game. It doesn't matter.
That comes back to when playing the Premier League fantasy football, the best analogy for that is they'll all peak at some point, but most of the time they don't. And you're looking at what the best fit run of fixtures, but obviously in your terms, you're looking at who are they going to be coming up against player for player. And then that's when you put them in, and then you get them out, and you get the next one in, and you just mix and match them based off the fixtures. You get your big hitters, and then the rest you sort of just rotate. And it's the same with the defenses and the kickers and all those ones. You don't need to keep them for the whole season. You just pick and choose unless you're in one of those crazy ones where you have to take 2 and you have one as a bench and there's none left. You just rotate them based off the fixtures, and that's one of the things I got on the list. Is that's what I would do every week. Is I just go through all the teams, looking at their matchups, looking at of how you're ranking DST teams and kickers, and how a few of the other guys are. And then just mix and match in each week, and I might have 10 teams and change the DST on all 10 of them in every week. And it doesn't take long, but at the same time, you're just constantly keeping it fresh with what's based off the match that's coming up that week. Because I was saying to you last week, there was 2 games that I won by literally 1 point in each one, and they were 2. I have 3 leagues, which are classed as my most important ones, and I was losing 2 of them, and I ended up winning both of them literally by a point. and they would come down to changing the DST, changing the kicker just for that week, and they just happened to, based off the fixtures, they did better. And if I hadn't changed them, I'd have lost both matches.
And I think that it's a good thing you mentioned that, because that's one thing to pivot to. We've talked about that there's not much you can do. Once the draft is done, you've got to pull the players. But I've always been of the fundamental belief that you need to have a certain amount of your bench that you rotate, that you constantly are refreshing your bench, that you can't hold players. And that, for me, you've got to have a player. And if you've got a player you've got no circumstance you're ever going to play, they need to go off your team. You need to get rid of them. You ship them out via trade. You ship them out via free agency, whatever you got to do. But you got to get them off the team. And you've just got to have positions where you're constantly rotating for exactly the scenario you've just mentioned, where you've got to look at positions where you can make marginal gains. And this is the difference between fantasy managers who will win leagues and fantasy managers who won't and will besmirch injury luck. Like, injury luck now is something that happens that you can now do something about. Now, if you lose your star player in week 15 at the first round of your playoffs and you get eliminated, I hear you. That's bad injury luck. Like, that is, you got no time to pivot, got no time to change. You are where you are. But in week 8, you've got, like, you lose Chris Godwin, you can pivot. It's not the same, but you have to think about how you can get the same amount of points into your lineup, but you've got to think about how you do that. So you just mentioned it there. DSTs and kickers do not refresh in leagues anywhere near enough. And if I had lost Chris Godwin this week, as I have done in about 60% of my leagues, I will now have to find ways to generate points. And that is one of them. Finding kickers and DSTs that have advantageous matchups and constantly refreshing and reworking them is a very, very big part of that. Because, as you say, you gain 2 or 3 points.
Yeah,
but that's 2 wins.
But on the back of that, the other thing that's real key is understanding your league with the scoring more than anything, because that's what a lot of people will just try and, I don't know, put square. What's the phrase about putting square pegs into round holes? They're like, I've got this player, he's good, I'm putting him in whatever happens, and you don't really give it much thought. When you've got someone sitting on your bench where the point system suits them much better, you've got to know where you score your points. And like the Scottish Bowl is a prime example of that one. Like one of the guys that I'm in contact with in one of the other groups is I'm not sure how you pronounce his surname, but Rich is it Rich Beattie? He's an Australian guy. So knowledgeable when it comes to NFL, and he's done so much analysis on Scottish Bowl for retainers. So like I'm about 170th at the moment in the whole thing. I was a lot less than that at one point, but I'm only there because of the work that he does. And so I'm completely every week streaming 3 to 4 retainers in that Scottish Bowl team. This week, I think because of Godwin and Shaheed getting injured, I think I've got 7 retainers, maybe 6 or 7 retainers in my starting team who are all projected to score 1 point, half a point, who might retain 40 points. Like I am. Some of the players that I've had in there based off his analysis and other people. So like Fantasy Points do charts on expected points for retainers and stuff. I've been using that as well. And you've got to be constantly watching it, because the second someone gets injured, they might be doing punt returns. Next thing they might be doing kick returns, or they might be doing, if someone else gets injured, that guy might move up as to being a standard wide receiver, and he's not doing any of that. So then you're looking for who the next person is. And I've been streaming them for the last 5 or 6 weeks in Scottish Bowl, and it's kept me, because I keep losing my good players like Godwin and Shaheed, it's keeping me up there because I'm watching it and finding the points from somewhere else.
And I think that's, again, it's not always just about those deep leagues and things like that. I mean, that's a really key part of it in a big charity league where you have to stream and you have to do things like that. But even in a standard league, right, where you've got a traditional 5 or 6 bench, and you haven't got the stash options, which means there's more on the waiver wire.
Yeah.
I'm of the fundamental belief that if you put in the most transactions and you're not doing them for transaction sake, then you should make the playoffs just purely on probability, on the amount of turnover and work. Like I've always put in the books that you've got to outwork your opponent, which is something you do. Yeah. But I also think that it doesn't, people go, okay, great. So an action point from this should be, rotate your kicker, rotate your DST. If you've lost an injury player and you've lost points out of your lineup, and one thing you should do is you should look at your points scored every week, right? Look at where your points scored every week are and work out what your average points scored is. Look at that versus the average of the league. Look at that for your opponents. It's a bit of work, but in your league's record, the ones that matter, you should do this. And then once you've done that, you should, with injuries, you should now work out what your point differential is. How many points have you lost from losing Chris Godwin or losing Rashid Shaheed? How many points have you lost per week?
Yeah.
And you'll come up with a number, and it will be somewhere like 4-5 points a week, right? And you're not going to replace that with one player. And people think like, oh, okay, well, I'm just going to replace. Well, then now what you need to do is you need to think of how you make those gains. How do you find a way to get 5 points in your back in your lineup every week? It might be through trade. You might have to trade a player to make that up. You might have to trade a bit of depth from your bench where you're really strong and do that. You might have to, and one of my favorite arguments, people say to me, like, I can't trade my depth. Can't trade my depth. No, because if something happens, every player on your bench is scoring 0 when they're on your bench. So they are, by pure definition, worthless. Now, I understand why you've got a bench, and I understand why you keep depth for bye weeks and things like that.
Yeah.
But ultimately, your bench is served to be replaced. That's the whole point of it. So holding players and having a player who you're never going to play, if you can get a return for them that yields more points in your starting lineup, you should absolutely do it. And yes, if the worst case, you're playing to win.
That's exactly what I was going to say. You're playing to win. You're not playing just to qualify and then get knocked out early on. You're going all in to win, or what's the point?
And I think that's key, because people go, well, what if I lose this? If I get this player lose to injury, I'm stockpiling 4 running backs, and then, if Derrick Henry gets injured, I'm still going to be okay.
Yeah,
I get the sentiment. The opposite argument is, what if he doesn't get injured?
Yeah, and you're just sitting there.
What if Derrick Henry doesn't get injured, and you have a player on your bench who is worth something to somebody else?
Yeah.
That you can trade to get more points in your lineup that will set you up for victory. Now, when you make that move is really crucial. I'm not saying we're probably at that stage yet, but every week from now, your asset on your bench is decreasing in value because there are less weeks for that player to make a difference.
Yeah.
If that player has got a bye week, they've lost even more value. And so having a player on your bench who you're never going to play unless it comes to injury, it doesn't help you. It doesn't help you as much. It helps you in the beginning. It helps you through the first 3, 4, 5 weeks of the season. But actually now, every single week you hold on to that player, it's a depreciating asset. And so actually you need to think about getting that player off your roster and turning it around into something else. The other thing you need to think about and how to generate points. So one is trades to bring in a better quality of starting lineup. The second thing you can do is you mentioned streaming. So you mentioned streaming DSTs and kickers. I would also think about streaming wide receivers. Yeah. You know, there were advantageous.
I stream anyone, to be honest, if they're available. Yeah. But for me, the way I would think about it is I'd take a step back first before I do that. So like the first thing I'd be doing at the start of the week, probably once the game's finished on the Monday night, go and select your team for the week on the Tuesday morning if you can, or sometime on the Tuesday. Select it based off, you're not making any other changes. No, based off what you know, who's the best players available that you've got at that time. So put them all in your team, and that's how you start to analyze your team to know where you're short that week. So before you get to Wednesday or the Tuesday evening and you're panicking trying to do all the waivers because you've got so many leagues, do a bit of analysis first and try and just work out where am I short. So I don't know. At the moment, I think I've got, if you take away best ball, I've probably got about 15 dynasty leagues and about 12 redraft leagues, something like that.
I can put that on,
which is nothing to do with what on the level that you've got. But that's basically what I've got there. So what I would be doing is, if you look at the ones that dynasty are on the left there, I would go through every one of those teams, set the rosters, and then I'd be like, oh shit, I forgot I've got these players on bye week, too many players on a bye week, I'm short of wide receiver, or I know this team's playing this team, and I already know just by looking at that's not going to work out well. And then just make a few notes for each team saying, okay, this team, I need to focus on wide receivers, a tight end, or I don't like the DST match, so I'm going to be looking for a new DST team. I just a couple of notes for each one of them, working my way through the list. And then when it comes to actually doing the work, then to identify them, what I tend to do is I would look at a few different places. So I'd be listening to a few pods, but if anyone that I like trust does rankings early in the week. So say if you did rankings in the week, like a provisional one of this is at the moment, this is where we are, or I might get the fantasy points one or something. So anything that's gone up early, I'll go through them. And what I try to do is I'll just highlight in a colour. I'll bang it into Excel, highlight in a colour anything that's caught my eye that was, someone who's high who I wasn't expecting to see high. So like, for example, I was looking at someone today who's in the top 20 for wide receivers. I can't remember who it was now. And when I saw it, I was like, I was expecting him to be like 40 or 50. So I just highlight him in a colour, and I work my way through, and I just in the different positions and try and see, is there anyone there that I wasn't expecting to see so high?
If it was mine, it's probably Sterling Shepard.
There was someone else I saw. I can't remember who it was, but like I will generally do that for like a few different different things, just to gauge like what people are thinking, and then they're potentially waiver wire trades that people aren't even talking about on their shows and stuff, because all of a sudden he's projected to score these points and it catches your eye, and like, okay, I'll write that down, and then I just build up a list of waiver wires overall based off looking at all the different teams, and then I start adding them in the evening time, and then obviously see how you get on the next day when they happen. So like I would be doing that, making sure that anyone who's gone on IR gets put on IR on the list, so it frees up a bench spot. Obviously looking at bye weeks, just looking at the weak areas really and trying to identify them. I then go through, and there's like 3 or 4 different shows that I might watch, make my list, do the waiver wire, and then do it again the next day. So on the Wednesday, I would once the waiver wires have gone through, I pick my team again based off all the players I've just picked up again, and then do it and have another look and say, okay, am I okay now, or am I still short? And then do it again for the next day, and until I get to a point where I feel comfortable enough. And then you're waiting for injury news. And if you hear someone, on a Thursday night, someone gets ruled out, you've got to be looking then who's their backup for the next day's worth of waiver wires, and see if you can fit them in that way. So it's just the more you can do that earlier in the week, when you get to the weekends and all the madness happens like an hour before kickoff, and you get news that you weren't expecting, you've only really got to change that player and not make 20 other changes at the same time.
And you've just really hit the time of the week where more fantasy games are lost, and it's lost between the last 120 minutes before kickoff. That is where more fantasy managers will lose games than any other period of the week. And the reason why that is they haven't done the work. They get to set their lineup. They realize they've got a late injury. They're umming and ahhing. They're making start-sit decisions under pressure.
Yeah.
And then they will make the wrong decision. So they're not analyzing the decision through the week. They're analyzing the decision an hour before kickoff. And they haven't had time to do the research. They haven't had time to listen to everything. And they're like, oh, okay. And then what they do is they go with the bigger name or the bigger draft capital.
Yeah.
Well, he was a 3rd-round player, so I'm going to select him. And so that is where fantasy managers will lose more often than not, because they haven't put themselves into an advantageous position to win. Yeah. And so if you're able to do the work, and I always tell people, I mean, you go one step beyond me. I actually don't touch my lineups until at least Wednesday, sometimes Thursday.
That's because you've got about 100 lineups.
I mean, that's part of it. The other part of it is, for me, is I guess it's really, when you've done this and when you set as many lineups as I do, I go into a bit of an autopilot. Yeah. So for
I'm still learning that.
Yeah. And so you have an osmosis and a process that I do. And so doing that twice I don't get any benefit of doing it the second time, because on Tuesday I know who I want to target. I know where my team is strong and where it's weak, because I'm constantly aware of where my team is and I know where to make the adjustments. And then it's about thinking how I do that. And also, this season I've had to do it less until now because I have had strong teams. I've had strong teams with plenty of depth, and I felt pretty good about where most of those teams are. And the ones that are struggling, that's the ones that take a bit of work. But I would say that you set your team on a Wednesday. So you set a team on a Wednesday, then, especially because you've done your waivers, that's also gone through, you know where you are, you see where you're short, and you think about where you do it. And then you think about, where can I get more points into the team? And I look at free agency and I'm thinking about who's got advantageous wide receiver matchups this week. Am I looking at someone like Jalen Naylor? Am I looking at someone like Rashad Bateman? Am I looking at these guys and thinking, can these guys produce just enough for me?
Yeah.
And then also, is anyone in my team got a really bad matchup? Like if I have a roster with Devonta Smith this week, I actually put in my Fantasy Pros column this week. If you've got Quinton Johnston, he is absolutely persona non grata in lineups this week because he's got the worst matchup going against Marshawn Lattimore. But Devonta Smith has Mike Hilton. So, like, those two, I'm just like, I'm out everywhere. So then I'm thinking, okay, well, I'm going to lose points there. That comes off my expected points lineup. How do I manufacture more points? Okay, well, I can look at the streaming matchups at DST. I can look at the streaming matchups with kickers. Tips on how to do that. Kickers, you want to find someone who's kicking indoors. So I always mark down kickers, like even the best ones like Justin Tucker, like Young Hoku. I'll always mark them down a little bit when they're kicking outside in difficult places. That's just the norm. I'll always take the indoor kicker over an outdoor kicker. So find people that are kicking indoors. That will always give you a bit of stability.
Players not on jury duty.
Pardon?
Players who are not on jury duty.
Yeah. Brandon Aubrey as well. Yeah, it's a good one. And then DSTs, you're looking for people try to analyze DSTs on points. I analyze on turnovers. So I actually think about turnovers as one of the quickest ways because it's a two-header. You get the points for the turnover, but then you also get the points which aren't going to come off from the points and the yards being conceded.
Yeah.
So that's the quickest way for a DST to generate an extra swing, right? But then so you analyze those, then you analyze them with wide receiver matchups, and you have to manufacture how you get an extra 5 or 6 points into your lineup every week. It's not always possible, but if you can do that, what you're doing is you're decreasing your probability of luck. So that if someone has a dip week, if someone has a bad matchup, if someone just gets injured in the first quarter, you're mitigating that with additional points. And that's what you have to get into the mindset of doing. And that's what you've done. And look, you're doing this to huge success because you're grinding out victories where on paper you probably should have lost games. And this is why this is such an important topic now at this point of the season, because I don't want anybody to come to me in January and say, I didn't make my playoffs because I lost Chris Godwin.
Yeah.
Because
I'm just looking at that document behind you and noticing I've just clicked on a couple of things. I'm going to send you a different one because I'm looking at that Scott Fishbowl that says I've won 1 and lost 3, where it actually should be 1-11. I missed the 1.
Yeah.
What happened there?
I also noticed your rules menu is not pulling in your win losses for Dynasty.
Yeah, I was updating it as I was sending it to you. I'm just changing them now.
No, but it's still the point stands, and you're looking at the win.
But the first thing I'd be doing with that list is anything in red. They're the ones that are getting my focus this week. So like I'm looking at, I've got 4 leagues there where I'm 3 and 4. So they would be my focus, trying to turn them to 4 and 4s this week. I am obviously plus the 3 leagues that I always focus on the most as well.
Yeah. There's a questions coming. It'll be interesting. Get your thoughts and then I'll give mine. Trade Mahomes plus Brees or Kyron for Jay Daniels, Pollard, and Neighbors. Redraft Superflex. Wide receiver 1 is Jefferson. Other QBs are A. Rich and Jameis Winston. I'm 2 and 5.
Those two quarter Richardson and Winston. you just don't know what you're going to get from them from week to week. They could be getting you 25 points and you get you 5 points.
I mean, I'm looking at this, and let's work the maths out. Mahomes is going to get you 15 a week on current form. Brees, similar. I'd trade Brees, not Kyron, by the way. So you ship 30 points. Let's say on average 30, 31 points, right? Don't ship Kyron, ship Brees. And you get Daniels. So Daniels will give you 18-ish. Let's say 18 to 20. Pollard is going to get you 14. Neighbors is going to get you in a PPR, which is what I'm assuming this is. He's got a safe floor of.
I'd be taking the
12
for sure. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, obviously, you work out who you're dropping from your lineup to make room for this. But listen. The way I ship this is you're upgrading at QB, so you're not relying on Winston. You're upgrading at wide receiver, I would assume. And you take a dip on Pollard for Brees, but I don't think it's that much of a dip. Yeah, I'd absolutely snap this trade off. Especially at 2 and 5, you've got to do something, right? So if you could ship Mahomes and Brees for Daniels, Pollard, and Neighbors, I'd snap in that. Yeah, I'd make that happen because Mahomes is going to finish outside the top 12 QBs unless something miraculous happens. Daniels is en route to be a top 5 QB. Neighbors is on course to be a top 5, top 6 wide receiver. And then, you're going to lose a little bit of running back. But if you're keeping Kyron, you've still got a top 5 running back there.
Yeah, oh no, definitely. Yeah, I would much prefer that.
Yeah, I don't even think that's close. So, so we talked about streaming. We talked about adding points to lineups. We talked about being contrarian, so taking advice, knowing what the other players in your league listen to, and where they're getting their advice, and actually then being the contrarian and getting advice from other people, so that the advice that you're getting is different from them, to be more contrarian. Talked about the workload.
It's more because I'm not at that level to be able to do it off my own judgments. That's what like. Whereas like obviously the more you watch this and the more you play it, the more you've got your own judgments, and I'm sort of trying to piece other people's together and based off the little knowledge I have, trying to make my calls. But it's harder for me to do, as you say, like when you haven't even watched the game for longer than this is like only going into the third year of actually watching it. So I'm learning loads even about just the actual game itself, never mind fantasy, around all the other sides of things. Because like that, what's the name, Orkney Bowl, you have to put 2 IDP players in every week as well. So that takes it to a whole different level for me. As in, like, I don't know enough about that to be able to follow that myself and say, okay, I know who some of the big hitters are, but they're always gone anyway in other people's teams. So I basically I won that Orkney Bowl by streaming the IDP players every single week for the whole season, because I would go off I'd look at people's rankings and then try and piece together a consensus view of who the best players were on that week, and just kept changing them. And that's how I managed. Like, I think that's probably how I won that league, was based off the points that they got. Whereas most of the people I was playing against would get a really good two or three players, and they'd just stick with them for the season. Yeah,
and again, I think if I was to tell people the 3 reasons why they lose at fantasy football, number 1 is because they set their lineups an hour before or 2 hours before, and haven't done the work through the week, so they put themselves in a difficult situation. The second thing they do is they hold on to draft capital way too much. They assume that they got a player that they took so early on that they have to keep that player in that position, and they have to hold no matter what. And then the last thing I would say is just an unwillingness to train to do something different and to add an element of risk. So I just always look at it, and you and I are very similar in mindset, that you play to win the game, and actually coming 12th is just as good as coming 3rd.
Unless there's money involved. Yeah.
Well, yeah, unless you're getting paid at 3rd, but all right. Yeah. But let's say top 3 get paid. Finishing 12th and finishing 4th is the same thing.
Yeah.
So
Basically.
there's no glory in it, and there is almost a satisfaction of throwing everything at the kitchen sink and going, okay, it didn't work. I finished last, but would I have done anything different? Well, other than drafting a new team at the start, I don't think I'd have done a lot different. I tried to adapt and played the hand I was dealt, and I didn't do a good, it didn't work out, but I played the hand I was dealt, and that is the way it is, But people are so risk averse, and you see this with stockpiling of players, and the amount of, I could analyze a fantasy roster and the amount of players sitting on a bench, and I'm like, at this point of the season, why are you, unless your team is like 7-0, 6-1, that's when you can say, right, well, I'll stockpile, because actually my week-to-week matchups are irrelevant.
Yeah.
Because I'm going to be a 1 or a 2 seed. So
that's what I'm starting to do with a couple of these teams now. Is exactly that. That's why I was asking you the other day around.
Yeah.
You do your weekly rankings, but I'm more now starting to get more interested in what's the rest of the season ones, because I want to plan for like 4 weeks, 5 weeks down the line, and not just this week.
The problem with rest of season rankings is it's rest of season's rankings based on today's information.
Yeah, I know.
What you really want to do, and what I'm going to do for you tomorrow on the Patreon cast when I drop it, is I'm going to talk about, now we have enough data, we've got 7 weeks worth of data. Who has the advantageous schedules for the fantasy playoffs?
Yeah.
Weeks 15, 16, 17. Which teams and which players have the most advantageous schedule, so that you can start to finesse ideas of either trades or picking up talent and stockpiling talent. Who are the key, and then on top of that, looking at things like work rate of running backs, and who is potentially going into that running back red zone, high risk of injury. Yeah. And so who are the backups that are going to get more substantial work into the place? If
you could do that from week 12 as well, because I was looking at the what's name just for the Scottish Bowl. I'm at the Scottish Bowl. I'm 11-3 at the moment, and you need 12 points to qualify. So if I qualified this weekend, I'm already through with like 4 weeks to spare. So it's got me thinking already around. Obviously, you want to get the most points you can now, but at the same time, to stockpile on the bench for what happens in week 12.
Well, that's a different format, because with the Scottish Bowl, you still need to put up points because you carry over your regular season points into the playoffs. So like your average, your weekly average, so it can't come at the detriment. Whereas actually in other leagues where you're on course to book, so like I've got a few 7-0 teams, and you're like, okay, so my remit for those teams are, I'm going to make the playoffs in those teams. Like for me to fall off now would be catastrophic. So now it's about, okay, I need to think about how stockpiling it with those teams is very different, because the remit is actually, I don't care about the next 7 weeks. I only realistically need to win 4 more games to secure a bye. So if I do that, that's fine. How do I ensure I'm set up for success in the playoffs? And I can use that talent to find ways to do that. And this is where those situations and understanding where your team is goes back to those 4 buckets at the very beginning of the conversation. If you're in a team that's sailing through the playoffs, a lot of what we're saying right now probably isn't relevant right now. It's going to be more relevant in a few weeks' time. So you're looking forward, you're thinking about players you can stash, you're thinking about schedules going into the playoffs, you're thinking about how you can have the best team possible. You effectively have, as a 7-0 team, a 6-1 team, you effectively have a 7-week advantage, because now you can do all the work. You can look at who has the best schedules, who are the key backups to pick up. You can start handcuffing your running backs. You can do all those key things. Whereas all the other teams have to do a lot of work now. So there's a lot of surgery. You can start picking off trades and helping those teams at 2 and 5 get into the playoffs by offering a bench piece for some stash pieces that will be really good for you in the playoffs. And so they're the kind of things you need to start being unilateral and moving around and thinking about, looking at your quarterback schedule and those sorts of things. Whereas now, for everybody else, you need to think about how you manufacture points into your lineup and how you do that now, when using some of the techniques and skills and planning. And more important, I think it's the planning part of how you plan your week is how you get success.
as we said, as you can plan all you want, but there is still quite a lot of luck to this. Like I'd never sit here and say, "Oh, my season's going great because I did all these wonderful things." You also have to have a hell of a lot of luck along the way. Like some of those teams have been absolutely decimated with players, and the people coming in to cover them are just nowhere near as good, and they can't get back what they've lost, and they can't even get closer. They can build some of it up. But like it's just like there is a lot of luck involved in this as well, and it's just how you react to it when it goes against you, isn't it?
Yeah, but then the other thing I would say is in those situations is if you've lost a really big piece, and let's say, and I go back to Chris Godwin because I can't think of a bigger piece that's been lost this season other than Christian McCaffrey.
Yeah.
All right. You've lost his points, his 15 odd points a game, right? You've lost that from your lineup. And your replacement worthy is 7, 8, 10, 12, whatever it is, right? So you got to make 5, 6 points up. You might end up shipping your quarterback.
Yeah.
So you might actually go, right, okay, let's do a deal where I trade my second best player. And you go, okay, well, look, I've got Josh Allen. I'll trade Josh Allen for, I don't know, Baker Mayfield or Joe Burrow or someone like that, plus another piece. And it might be those supplemental pieces that get you the additional points. So sometimes you can add through subtraction.
Yeah.
You might have to trade your next best player to ship that to get the points you need. And that's where that analysis of knowing how much you score on average per week and knowing how much your players score and knowing how that point construct is really important, because you need to know how many points you need to generate and manufacture. How much can you do through streaming? How much do you need to do through acquisition of trade?
I was going to ask you a question here because I've heard the odd person talk about some of it before, but more trying to figure out, and it's not something I could do based on my knowledge, but the likes of yourself and some of the other guys, it's like trying to interpret when somebody might get dropped for somebody else so that you've got that person. So say, for example, Will Levis, it was this, everybody knew at some point he was going to be thrown to the side if he carried on doing what he was doing, but it's not trying to know when that might actually happen. So like in Dynasty, it's different because you'll have a ton of benches with loads of different plans. Of if this happens, I've got this guy. If that happens, you can't really do that the same with redraft. So you've sort of got to be a bit more accurate with, I think this is going to happen round about this time, so I'm going to put this plan in place to maybe sneak some value into my team based off that actually happening.
Yeah, I would say the biggest way that this pays off for you as a strategy, it's at the running back position and it's from week 11 onwards. Okay. So I would say from week 11, week 12 onwards, you will need to start gambling on players that have high touch rates, and you'll need to start looking at players, and we do it here, so, you know, like you won't need to do it because I'll tell you, but in terms of we'll need to, I look at every single year, I look at players with high touch rates, and I say that their touch rate is unsustainable. And so at some point, there is going to be a drop-off, and that drop-off will either be injury or it will be a reduced workload, because they're either going to stockpile the player and like basically just hold back the work for the playoffs, or because they've already seen such a significant amount of work, they're in that red zone where injury is at risk. Yeah. And so you need to find those opportunities and be ahead of the game.
Would it be important to, I'm just, because I'm already trying to solutionize it in my head as I ask the question, and I'm starting to think of like, you know, like when you get to like, week 10 or whatever, 11, and those teams are not going to the playoffs and they've got their rookies who haven't really had much game time yet, it's that some of those might be the ones to target because they're about to be given game time and they might go off.
Potentially, but it really also depends. There's so many different factors. So touch rate's one. Contract situation is a much bigger one than people will ever give it credit for. Yeah. So if you've got a running back in the last year of his contract, there's no offer for a new deal, the franchise won't give a toss.
Yeah, they want to try something.
They might have a rookie behind, but if the season's lost, they might not put the rookie out. They might just say, This team's bad. We're not going to risk the injury of him. Whereas if we lose a player if a player gets injured, it's going to, and this is harsh. This is really harsh. Josh Jacobs is the best example of this with the Raiders. We knew that he was not re-signing with the Raiders, right? So we knew he was going. And it was like, well, we'll just run all the tire off of Josh Jacobs because he's not going to be here next season. That's why it's such a big season in terms of carries, in terms of touches, because they didn't care. Because he wasn't their problem next year. So they didn't need to worry about Bam White or anyone else behind. Yeah, Bam White got a bit of work and there was a bit of flux. There's some breaking news that Puka Nacua might be playing tonight.
I need to get him off my IR quickly.
Rams plan to play Puka Nacua tonight. They won't decide until pre-game warm-ups how much he can play. What's that?
What time do I need to stay up to know that one?
12 o'clock. So it looks like he's going to play, but they don't know how much. So it sounds like he's going to be on account. So he's off IR. TJ Hawkinson is out. Anyway. So yeah, I would sit Nacua. If I'm in the UK, I'm not playing Nacua. He can sit. If he has a big week, so be it. But that sounds like to me he's on account. He's going to play, but he's going to play a limited amount. Okay, fine.
Back as well, isn't he?
Yeah. So contract situation's really important. Season situation was important. Touch rates, and there's about 5 different elements. I think, sort of rapport and relationship. Offensive line is something that's really important because if the offensive line's bad, the rookie, it doesn't matter how much work they're going to get, it's still not going to be effective. Yeah. So there's a lot of different factors that go into this and analyzing the talent that comes up. The best thing that you can do, and I advocate this strategy every season, when you get to around week 12 or week 13, you should have 2, maybe 3 bench spots that you're just picking up backup running backs.
Yeah.
And you literally are just hoarding them because there's always a guy every year that comes out of nowhere, that all of a sudden gets promoted and goes off and be a league winner to you. I think back to CJ Anderson with the Rams. I think back to there was a guy on the Chiefs. I can't remember his name when Kareem Hunt and the video came out and he got cut. Williams. Yeah, when Williams came out and he was a league winner. And these situations happen, and they happen every year. So, again, this comes back to process. The process I recommend is when you're getting to the end of the fantasy regular season, you should have bench spots where you shouldn't need to roster a spare quarterback. You shouldn't need to roster a spare tight end. You shouldn't really need to roster that many running backs. You shouldn't need to roster any DSTs or kickers. So, effectively, if you have 6 bench spots, you should have 2 wide receivers, 4 running backs. And you should just pick up all the spare running backs, and then literally you're just rotating and you're guessing, and you're just picking them up. And you basically are just chasing. You're chasing the lottery ticket.
Yeah.
But you need to have the extra tickets because because listen, when you get to the playoffs, every roster, every lineup is good, right? Some will be better than others, absolutely. But every starting lineup, the bench is irrelevant in the playoffs.
Yeah.
It's irrelevant. All you're doing there is you're buying lottery tickets. So you don't need to have a backup quarterback. You just need to have these pieces in place. So you need to have who's the next CJ Anderson? Who's the next, who's the next Isaiah Pacheco? Who's the next Jerick McKinnon? Because there's one every year. There always is. There's one every year. Who is that person? And it's much better if they're on your roster than you having to bid fab or FA for them and you're not in the position to get them.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
So that's we'll do that from like week 12 onwards, and we'll start looking at some profiles and names and situations. But yeah, I think the game theory now, to summarize, and then I'll give you the opportunity to sign off, is outwork your opponents, get your lineup set, follow a process, work out where your gaps in points are, manufacture points through streaming, make trades if you need to, but more importantly, Stop just stashing talent. Use that talent whether to acquire better starting lineup perspective or refresh your bench and constantly keep turning your bench over. And then stream. It's a big part. Is there anything else you want to share from what you've learned in your journey through fantasy football to manufacture wins?
I would just say a lot of people are probably put off thinking it's so complicated that they won't get into it. And I suppose it's just that this is an example of if you're willing to read up on it and roll your sleeves up, you can pick it up a lot quicker than you think. So like what I tried to do after the first season I played, like I think I entered, I can't remember exactly, but say I entered 20 tournaments and I'd never watched the game of NFL. I think I won 5 of those 20 tournaments in the first year without knowing anything. And you can do this with a lot of different sports. It's about following the stats and looking at the trends and stuff. And you don't have to know the insides and out. You just need to be able to spot who's doing well at a particular time, and you can learn as you go. But what I did do was on my Twitter, I put I just started following people and building up a list of people to follow. And I kept it going. And then at the end of the first season, and I think the second season, I just sent it back out again, saying, if anyone wants to get into it, here's a list of people. And there must be about 400 or 500 Twitter accounts on the list. And if you follow that list, it will just have them all there. And you can just watch the news coming up and the updates and the takes and the stats that everyone's posting. And I still use that every day. Like I've got so many different people on it, and you sort of getting a bit of information from all these different people and trying to build up your own view and opinion on things. And you can pick it up a lot quicker than you think if you put the effort in.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing, isn't it? It's effort. But we're here to help distill, and hopefully shows like this will break up some of the noise. And if you're not sure where to find it, and we're doing stuff every day mostly, and you find it. And also, if you've really enjoyed this conversation and you're like, oh, I want to I want to have these levels of conversation. This is what our Patreon chats are like often. It's not just asking about players.
I wouldn't know half the stuff without it, to be honest. Like I learned most of the stuff at the beginning mainly from the likes of yourself. Probably from a redraft point of view, definitely yourself. And then Rich, from a dynasty point of view, I'd use different, but redraft, which is the main focus this time of the year, that's how I learned most of the stuff at the beginning was from you. And then I've just gone further on then and listened to more and more things and read more things. But if I hadn't listened to your content at the start and entered your leagues, I wouldn't be doing probably any of this now.
Well, I appreciate that, and it wasn't a plug, but the Patreon chats are good because we have this high level of discussion where we do it on the WhatsApp chat, and it is just trying to work out all these different angles and working it out, and it's not just like, oh, we're selecting this player for this player's sake. And and it's not just me; it's everyone in the group is chiming in with ideas.
You get a lot of different ways of thinking, which is for me, it's all about how do I improve my thinking on situations. And someone will say, "Oh, I think this," but they won't just tell you why they think. They'll give you the whole background behind it, and you just start to learn more and get better at making decisions as you go.
Yeah, 100%. Danny, this has been amazing, and I think that people listening to this will have picked up a lot and they've learned a lot, and will definitely manufacture. And I think this is the sort of show that if you listen to now, and if you haven't been doing the things that we've talked about on this show, that's okay. There's time to do it and apply it and turn it into championships. So it's not a case of taking this now and going, oh, it's too late. This is a good point now if you've done none of this, pick it all up, start implementing it, and you'll turn some of this into fantasy titles. We promise you it. But tell everyone where they can interact with you, where they can find you, ask you further questions, and maybe like some of them looked at the sheet that we pulled up earlier and gone, oh, how would you help me build that? Or
maths is crap on that one. The calculation was wrong. I fixed that now. I don't know what happens with that when I sent it over. But I'm just on Twitter, to be honest. I don't do content or anything like that. But you can get me on Twitter, or I actually have a Discord for FBL, which is slightly different. But some people go onto that as well. You can see that off the Twitter. But to be honest, it's more just for chat. We don't really do anything except talk football on that, really. It's not major. Loads of arguments over football teams and stuff like that. But yeah, no, nothing major. Or you can join your Patreon and you can catch me there in the WhatsApp group.
Yeah, definitely can do that. I really appreciate it, mate. I think this has been it gave me a lot of food for thought because it's stuff I've done for years. Sometimes I pick it up, sometimes I put it down, but it's stuff I've written about, it's stuff I've talked about, and I was like, this is just such a timely reminder that doing this stuff works, and it has worked. It continues to work, and it's controlling the controllables. If you do all the things you can do to win a title, then you're more likely to achieve the outcome that you want. Whereas if you don't do any of this stuff and you rely on luck, you can't take the credit. You can't take the credit as a fantasy manager if you just pick the lineup every week and gone, that's it. Like, this is the stuff where I feel like you actually earn your belts. And your
the only downside I can think of is that you might have your wife because on a Sunday afternoon I'm like trying to push the kids away to sort my lineups, or in the evening time. So on a different note, that Orkney Bowl, because of the way he runs the Orkney Bowl, I got that many things sent to me. There's a trophy about this big, then there's another one this big, there was a glass one, I got rings, I got a helmet, and my wife's like, you're not putting that in the house, like all these different things. So it has the opposite effect on potentially on your marriage as well.
Yeah, I've definitely met a few wives who have found out who I am and have gone, yeah, thanks for that. I don't think your wife would be too keen the next time I come over to Dublin.
She loves Red Zone on a Sunday evening as well. Absolutely loves it.
This has been an absolute treat. I hope everyone engages with Danny. There's a lot to learn, and he'll also help you win a few quid at FPL and DFS as well. So make sure you follow him and pick up some of the tips. Again, he's been playing fantasy football not even 3 years, and he's one of the sharpest minds I know. So it's why we get him on here. It's why we talk, and lots of valuable lessons to learn. So follow him. Follow the pod. We'll be back tomorrow. We'll do the Fantasy Bible Part 2. We'll do some start sit. We'll fine-tune the lineups. Don't start TJ Hawkinson. He's out tonight. I would probably not start Puka Nakua, even though he is going to play tonight, it seems. That's going to do it. Thank you so much for tuning in. Any questions, do engage. Until then, Rush Nation, don't forget, as always, keep rushing.